Well, I called this like an enigmatic piece. The reason I picked this subject was purely because I didn't really understand what was going on with this parable. So it was a personal curiosity piece, and I thought we'd have a look in it. Sometimes it's called the Unjust Steward, sometimes it's the Clever Steward. It has various names, and it's a pretty challenging teaching, frankly, wrapped in what certainly appears to be an unusual parable. This character of the steward seems to be a relatively unattractive character. On first blush, he reads like a bit of a rogue. So what lesson could Jesus possibly be trying to drive home to his disciples using an unrighteous, slightly devious kind of person? Or, as some commentators suggest, are we missing the point? Is the poor old steward just a little bit down on his luck, made a few mistakes, but, he's just basically a kind-hearted soul who's trying to do the right thing, and it's nice to see a struggler get through in the end. Did we miss a few important clues that lead us to that conclusion? I don't want to spoil everything and say no, but no. Anyway, let's go through. There is, as one commentator, Kyle Snodgrass, a name which is very easy to remember and a book that is well worth getting. So if you ever see Kyle Snodgrass, Stories with Intent, now out in a second edition, grab it. Excellent book on the parables. Anyway, as he says, there is a bewildering number of explanations about this parable. Essentially, every possible angle on it has been taken by somebody in interpretation. And strangely, the amount written about this parable is almost inversely proportional to the length of the parable. We're not actually given that much detail. And people have got some spectacular interpretations, which probably demonstrates that when we go to fill in the blanks in Scripture, we can end up in some really wonky places. Sometimes we just need to pare it back to, well, what did Jesus actually say and mean? And kind of an important piece just to set that, I think, as a principle. In Luke chapter 1, verse 1, 2, 3, 4, Luke says he was very deliberate and self-conscious about the gospel he was writing. Right? He says, there are other books. I've read them, but I thought I would set out a more orderly account to help explain what's going on to you, Theophilus. So Luke thought that this parable was worth capturing. He's the only person who has this parable. It's not in the other Gospels. Obviously all the Gospel writers made choices as to what was included. John at the end of his Gospel says, you'd fill the whole world with books if we wrote everything down that Jesus said and taught. So clearly they were making some choices. So that probably leads us to, I guess, a couple of just two important points. Firstly, there's probably sufficient detail in there that Theophilus and whoever Theophilus then distributed the book to had enough information to understand it. And that there's some valuable message in there. It shouldn't be super obscure. So whoever Theophilus was, probably a pseudonym, probably a wealthy Greek or Roman patron, probably a believer, and undoubtedly, because it follows the same formula as other introductory dedications to patrons, probably someone who would then have been responsible for publishing Luke's material out further, both the Gospel and also Acts. But key thing, it ought to be understandable to someone who wasn't necessarily in Palestine. So to arrive at a reasonable conclusion, we need to walk through the parable and sort of, as we do so, just a couple of questions, I guess, to keep in mind as keys to understanding what's happening here. Firstly, why is he called dishonest? Right? He's called an unrighteous manager in verse 8. Now, why is that sort of like almost the concluding statement on this fellow? Is it because of his previous actions that led to his sacking, or is it his actions immediately after he was told he was not long for his employment? Is there some important context hidden from us that's, first century Judean agriculture and commerce? What was going on at the time that sort of informed the background facts, and does that have bearing on the interpretation of the parable? Why does the master praise the steward? It's a pretty weird response in the story that the master actually praises, and that's what the word categorically means. He praises the steward. Does that tell us something about the master, about the master's character? Some people speculate it does. Or is it just giving us another angle on this steward? And then what is the point of the comparison? Is Jesus teaching us to be like the steward, or is he telling us to not be like the steward? Or what exactly is Jesus, what does Jesus want to take from the parable? And that probably gives us a bit of a way of back solving. Read the last page of the mystery, and then you can rest confident that you know exactly who done it all the way through. So anyway, we'll walk through the parable. We'll try and answer some of these questions, gather a few more facts, winnow all the options down a little bit and get to what perhaps is a reasonable interpretation. And then, as my wife said, the only question that actually matters is the one you haven't put up there, Daniel. So what? What is the point of the parable? And back down to earth with a thud you come. All right. So let's just run through the facts of the parable in Luke chapter 16. So we have a certain rich man, pretty standard wording that Jesus uses introducing characters in his parable, and he had a wasteful steward or manager. Now, technically, the word there for a steward, it means an administrator, someone who manages the affairs of the household or estate. Complete Word Study Dictionary says it was typically, but not always, a slave. Not always a slave. Now, I think in this particular instance, it's not a slave. If he was a slave, you look at, how the situation plays out. If he was a slave, the consequences of his misadministration would have been, 6 of the best or 60 of the best, depending on how much energy the master had, and cleaning out the horse stables or something for the rest of his life. But he's actually facing the sack and moving to a new employer as his objective. So it seems like he's not a slave. He's a free person. And that's, there are certainly instances of that. So we have a free man who has a job managing an estate. Now, it is a very large estate, as we will see later. And some people report to the rich man, obviously people that he trusts, that the steward is wasting his assets. Now, it's interpreted variously, but it means to dissipate, to scatter. It's used of chaff being winnowed and tossed up in the wind. Essentially, it means to squander. He was squandering the resources of the estate. Now, if you flick back a chapter to Luke chapter 15, verse 13, you'll see that Jesus used the same word in the preceding parable. The prodigal son took his half of the inheritance, or his portion of the inheritance, and squandered it. Woo! Squandered it in wasteful, riotous living. Okay, so it's that sort of idea. That's what this steward, that's what this household manager is doing. Unlikely to be an accidental use. So the master demands the steward comes to him with the accounts, and the Greek is logos. It means the intelligent, explanation idea, the intelligent explanation of what is going on. It seems like he had to come with the book of accounts. Right? I'm an accountant. Once a year, if you're lucky, more often if you're not, the auditor comes through and you have to hand over the accounts. Demonstrate that what you've done is in order and everything balances and is right. And this is essentially what the master does with him. And it's used elsewhere, like, for example, the parable of the unforgiving debtor. The king calls his servants to settle up the accounts, to go through the records. So the steward now has a moment of reckoning. He has to turn up with the books. So it's not just a verbal account, there's going to be paperwork as well. And detailed books of accounts were not invented by accountants once Excel appeared. They've been around for donkey's years. We dig up tons of papyrus and clay tablets throughout the ancient Near East. You sort of hope that there's a ton of really good information, but most of it is actually, I bought a goat from Fred and it only had 3 legs. Please curse him, etc. There's a lot of just menial business details that, we just keep digging up everywhere. As I said, grocery receipts or complaints about noisy neighbours feature frequently. But anyway, there's books and records out there. And faced with a moment of truth, the steward demonstrates he's capable of some honesty, with himself predominantly. He's facing unemployment. And as he says, he's not a digger, he's not a doer, and he doesn't want to beg because he's got some pride. Now, it's very clear from the commentary of Jesus in verse 10 to 12 that the actions of the steward are unfaithful. He's demonstrated that he's an untrustworthy character. These are the words that Jesus keeps repeating in his commentary in verse 9, 10, 11, 12. There's no commendation of the steward's morality, but the steward is very clear-eyed about his situation. He's under no illusions about what his options are. He's in a crisis. And verse 4 starts with a rather dull in the NET, and your translation probably has something similar. Oh, I know what I'll do. Which really doesn't quite actually capture the drama and the excitement of the Greek grammar, a subject which is always very interesting to no one. But essentially, the NET notes and Robinson's word pictures say it's a very difficult tense to reproduce in English, but essentially it's like, oh, I've got it. I know what I'm going to do. It's like that. It's suddenly come to me, like when you have a really good idea as to, I don't know how you're going to steal the chocolate biscuits without getting caught or something. I see it now. There's a sudden solution to my quandary. He has a cunning plan. And the cunning plan is based very much on the cultural reality of patronage. If you did somebody a favour, they owed you. So the only people who know, and this is a key part of the plot really that Jesus is putting out, the only people who know about his impending unemployment is himself and his master. No one else yet knows. So he can still act like he's the steward. He can still exercise the authority of his position. And so he's going to provide a deed of benefaction which will ensure the master's debtors owe him. He's buying favour. Now, it says that the purpose of his cunning plan was that he might that he might be welcomed into the homes of others. There's a bit of discussion as to what that means. Some people say it's temporary accommodation, which has some good linguistic arguments for it. However, the man is being sacked. He needs future employment. That is clearly on his mind in verse 3. So it seems more likely that he's trying to buy himself into a new job, being the steward for somebody else. And, that's really part of Jesus' lesson that he takes from it as well. Just like the steward secured his future, you need to secure your eternal future. It wasn't a temporary solution that the man was after. Okay, so the clock ticking, our cunning hero, springs into action and he calls the debtors together individually. And I think that's a key part of the plan. And he makes them an offer they cannot refuse and don't want to refuse. Now, different translations will give you different things. I think my wife sort of translated stuff into gallons, which is useful if you're in America, bushels, which is useful for no one. Others have 100 measures of this, 100 jars of that. I think, you might have had jars at some point there, David, in your reading. Anyway, whatever. So the first debtor turns up. He owns 100 baths of oil. How much is that? Well, it depends. According to Josephus, who you'd hope would have some idea, he does some translations of a bath is this, blah, 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 and you get down to about 8.5 to 9 gallons. So some of your translations you might have sitting on your lap say that it was 900 gallons of oil. That's probably about right. What a bath was specifically did vary over time, and depending exactly where you were, the Romans had a slightly different value for it. But given that Josephus is unequivocal about the value, I think that 900 gallons we're on pretty firm ground with that. Sweet. How much is 900 gallons of olive oil or 100 baths of olive oil worth? Anyone want to have a stab? What? Soft skin forever? No, that's not the answer. What? Someone called something out. Couple of thousand? Yeah. It was around 3,000 denarii, roughly, 2,500 to 3,000. But 3,000 seems to be the most popular bet. So it's somewhere around the 3-year mark, a bit more, sorry. Ooh. Said that wrong, 1,000, which is what you said. I misread my notes. It's about 1,000 denarii, so 3 years' wages, give or take. All right, so about 3 years' wages worth of oil is what this fellow owed. A lot. So the next debtor owns 100 measures, and the word is cors, C-O-R-S, was the actual measure, 100 cors of grain. Now, again, according to the NET notes, that's about 39,000 litres of grain, which is about 100 acres worth of farmland. So a pretty sizable block, particularly back then, and worth 2,500 to 3,000 denarii. Most commentators seem to settle around the 3,000 denarii for that. So the first bloke, 1,000 denarii worth of oil, and the next person, about 3,000 denarii worth of grain. There is a little bit of inconsistency here. Josephus gives two completely different meanings for what a core is. He uses another one which would be double, 50% higher than this value, 50% higher. So, great, thanks Daniel, that was really boring. What are we dealing with here? Well, the simple answer is rich people. We're dealing with really rich people, right? One person owes about 3 years of wages, and the other person has a trading debt account, which is 8 to 9 years of labouring wages. These rich people. The level of produce involved in this suggests an estate which was about 20 times larger than the average family farm at the time, right? So 20 times larger. We are dealing with rich people. The master's rich, and the debtors that he is subletting part of that area to for them to produce, and he would take a share of the crops, are all very wealthy individuals. They're doing all right. Thank you very much. They are major business transactions that are going on here. Now, for way of comparison, in Ezra chapter 7, verse 22, a passage that immediately sprung to all of your minds, King Artaxerxes, when he's making provisions for the annual budget to run the temple under Ezra, he gives them supplies of 100 talents of silver, 100 cors of wheat, 100 baths of wine, and 100 baths of olive oil, and as much salt as you need. Right? So 100 cors of wheat and 100 baths of olive oil was supplies to keep the temple running for a year. Okay? These are significant amounts of produce. The steward is dealing with big players who can provide him with exactly what he wants, future employment. Right? They've got room for one more on the payroll, and he's creating obligation to get them there. Now, interestingly, he offers them different deals. Right? So the person who owns 100 baths of oil, he gives a 50% deduction. Financially, that's about 500 denarii off. Scrub that off your bill. The later debt, the grain debt, gets a 20% reduction. He goes from 100 measures cors of grain down to 80, 20% off. But in dollar terms, it's still about 500 denarii. Right? So he's essentially offering the same discount cash-wise, 500 denarii off for everyone. Make sense? Cool. All right. About a year and a half of the working man's wages off as a discount. Everybody wins, and he obviously figured that would be enough to give him some options in terms of future favour. Okay, so what the heck is he actually doing? Right? There's at least three main options as to what he's doing with this discount. Was he falsifying the amounts? Was he just ripping off his master? Was it coming out of his master's pocket? Popular choice. Was he taking the illegal interest? So was there actually secret usury just being added into the gross contract value, and he's wiping off the usury just back to the core principle and no one would challenge that because you couldn't exactly walk in and say I was charging interest. That's possible. Plenty of fine commentators think that's the case. And option number 3 was he was sacrificing his own commission. And that's why perhaps it was 500 denarii every time, because that was his commission and he's willing to forego that in order to get out of a spot of bother. And so the master's not been ripped off in any way, shape or form. Okay, well, let's have a you can make a credible argument for all of those positions. So if you have a diametrically opposed view to my conclusion, I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm not saying I'm right. I think on balance it probably falls this way, but that's cool. So what are some of the key facts, points in favour and against for each of the things? In terms of the falsifying, I think the fact that he has private meetings in verse 5, bit of a clue. Something dodgy's happening. There's an element of haste in verse 6. Write it down quickly. Let's get this done before time runs out. And it was the debtors who wrote the new note, which I think, if you're going to have a cunning plan, get it in someone else's handwriting. Tip number 1, when you're thinking about your criminal venture, get it in the other person's handwriting. And at the end in verse 8, he's called the unrighteous steward. In verse 8. So I think some commentators, even if I disagree with parts of what they say, they do make a valid point that the steward is essentially making making the debtors his co-conspirators. Right? He's essentially making them part of the plot. They don't question why they're suddenly getting this discount. And when everything suddenly gets revealed and the master can see what the new debts are, the conspirators, the debtors could fess up and pay extra, or they could just keep the discount. And the fact that they're having to write it in their own hand, I think the steward is binding them up in the conspiracy. In terms of the taking off the illegal interest, it is a fact that interest was frequently hidden in debtors' notes, and the Greek word is talking about a promissory note, and those sorts of notes were used to hide interest. So what you would do if you owed somebody $80, you'd have to write out a promissory note to say you owed them 100, and the 20 would be interest, which everyone knew, but wasn't called that because that obviously usury was illegal under the Old Testament law. All the evidence, people making this argument, seems to trace back to one scholar, a fellow by the name of Derrett, who claims that perishables frequently had a 50% interest rate, hence the olive oil goes from 100 baths down to 50 because of 50% interest rate. But he didn't seem to have any evidence other than Indian contracts in the last 100 years, so I thought that was a bit unlikely to be useful. There was some good evidence for a 25 to 30% interest on grain, but in this particular parable, of course, the reduction on the grain is 20%. So it's fair to say that reading, whilst often referred to, hasn't been widely accepted. So yeah, probably pass on that one. In favour of the personal commission, it does seem interesting that the financial discount is about 500 denarii on both accounts, suggests maybe it is commission. But contrary to that, the debtors would hardly be happy if they found out that this steward was regularly charging a 500 denarii commission and bring him on as their employee. They might think that maybe he'd been taking advantage of them in the past and they wouldn't actually feel like they owed him anything. So, question whether that's the piece. And if the man had been getting commissions of 500 denarii per debtor per year, unless he had a terrible gambling habit, he probably had a nice little pot of cash sitting in the back. So wouldn't have been in that much desperate need. So, yes, I think if we make decisions on these things, I think the interest suggestion suffers for a lack of evidence. I think the commission idea probably suffers for a similar reason. It's unlikely he'd be in a financial crisis if he'd been banking those sorts of commissions for long. So the very sparse facts we have, I think, point very much to the fact that he is committing further malfeasance. Having wasted the master's estate, he's now giving away the master's money to feather his future nest. And, we want to be careful about putting in additional facts to create an interpretation of parables. Very much a fan of going through the social historical context. Absolutely helps inform our understanding of Scripture, but it really should be informing what's there, not being Sally's gap filler, enabling us to create a whole new interpretation. Sometimes we do need to just go the Occam's razor. What is the simplest, most logical explanation based on the facts in front of us? So, conclusion, for me, maybe not for you, the steward ripped off his master by reducing the debts dishonestly. You can make great arguments, and people do great exposition based on he sacrificed his own commission and therefore he was using his money wisely and we should do the same. But I don't think it's actually what Jesus is saying. So we need to be consistent with what Jesus is actually teaching. Cool. So then we sort of, as I said, I think the narrative flow of the story, the revealed facts, pretty much demonstrate to a reasonable level of satisfaction that this guy had a cunning plan to rip off his master, discounting his master's income. And the master commends the unrighteous steward because he had acted shrewdly. The master had been outplayed. And I think that's exactly what's behind the master's comment when he praises the steward. He doesn't like the fact that he's been ripped off, but he can recognise a good game when he sees it. The debtors are complicit in the plan. They're not going to testify against the steward. They know they owe the steward. They're going to give him favour sometime in the future. The master suspects foul play, but all the accounts, all the circumstances, and his gut feeling, and probably the fact that the ink is still wet on the page, demonstrate that something's off with this whole situation, but he cannot nail anyone down on it. So he's been outplayed. And that's why he concludes that, well, this fella, he's shrewd, he's too cunning. And that the word shrewd there, it means prudent, wise, shrewd. I think shrewd is probably the best rendering here. The master can just recognise this guy, he got away with it. Oh, well played, you rat. And I think he probably said that under his breath. So to answer the kind of question 4, what's the point of the parable? Jesus sort of takes over the parable halfway through verse 8. The verse split I don't think is too useful. I think the first half of verse 8 is the master speaking, it's still the parable. The second half of verse 8 is Jesus' words, Jesus' conclusion on this, which we have. It's people, there's really two conclusions. Look how shrewd they are in dealing with their contemporaries, more so than the people of light, and you need to use worldly wealth, as the NET has it, unrighteous mammon, as other translations have it, so that you can be welcomed into eternal homes. So Jesus is sort of giving two lessons out of this parable in the first instance. Firstly, the people of the world, they might be wicked, right? They might be shrewd, but they sure as heck recognise a crisis and throw everything at resolving it. Right? They see the problem, they take action to make sure that their future is secure. Secondly, use wealth wisely with a view to your eternal reward. And that's kind of like the final piece to answer what is this parable actually about. Harry Whittaker sort of makes the concluding comment about this. He says, what Jesus put before his disciples for emulation was not the unscrupulous scheming of the steward, but the assiduity with which he purposely followed the path of personal profit. If only you, my disciples, would show the same business-like efficiency, pursuing what is, after all, your own self-interest. And how should you do it? By using mammon, money, and anything else the world can offer to further your own standing with God. That was Harry's sort of conclusion as to what the parable was about. So how was the manager dishonest? Discounted his master's debts. What's the economic background? Well, the debtors were very rich, but they were also turned into co-conspirators. Why does he praise the steward? Because he recognises the perfect crime. And what's the point of the comparison? Respond with urgency to the gospel and use dollars wisely, but honestly. And then Jesus goes on to provide some further commentary about wealth in verse 10 through 13. And there's a transition from an interesting story with some points to make in the parable to what frankly is some really uncomfortable teachings. I think if we're honest, verse 10 to 13 is kind of a section which, if we spend too long thinking about it, is personally challenging, tough. The parable is the easy part. It's the teachings that follow that get pointed. But let's work our way into that, because there's a couple of things to deal with on our way before we hit Jesus' teaching specifically. Verse 9, make friends for yourselves by how you use worldly wealth. The mammon of unrighteousness is the old King James, and unrighteous wealth is, I think, what you might have read, David, and there's other translations have similar things. The Greek literally is unrighteous wealth, or mammon, but, individual word studies, or two words in this case, are very dangerous, and to quote a very esteemed brother, using Strong's to understand the Bible, he didn't say that bit, is a bit like having a toolkit comprised only of hammers, or mainly of hammers. And you may also, just a side note, you may have heard at some point that Mammon was a name for an ancient Syrian god. I literally went through, it was the 8th Bible dictionary before I found anyone who actually mentioned that. And when they mentioned it, they said, I can't find the exact note, but it would be fine to say you could sum it up with no. So that's no, take that off the table. Now, make for yourselves friends by means of unrighteous mammon. Dead Sea Scrolls, super useful for understanding some of the language of the time. Unrighteous mammon didn't actually mean unrighteous as in wicked, worldly, naughty, dirty. We use the expression sometimes colloquially, filthy lucre. We don't actually mean it's bad and filthy or there's anything inherently wrong with it. It's now just turned into just an expression, things you say to fill in the time. And certainly the way it's used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the documentation there, it was just a stock idiom for all money, including money that was being used for good purposes. So we shouldn't read it that Jesus is saying mammon, money, is wicked, bad, unclean, dirty, or anything of the sort. It didn't actually carry that connotation, right? It's not ill-gotten gains or anything particularly that's been spoken of there. And interestingly, mammon is an Aramaic word, was sort of transliterated into Greek, and then various translators obviously just decided to pick the word up and put it into English as well. So we've now got one Aramaic word in our collection. We've probably got a few more if you put your minds to it later. All right, so yeah, important just to take that off the table. Now, the other piece which, if you're looking at that going, why is there that terrible green colour on faithful, trustworthy, and true, trustworthy? Because there's an interesting play which is way beyond my ability to access, so having to rely on other people for this. But Jesus would have been speaking in Aramaic, and the root word for mammon is the same root word that is behind the faithfulness and trustworthy and trust and true riches all the way through. So Jesus is actually making a play on words with mammon, which essentially means something you trust in, and are you trustworthy? Will you be true? Will you be faithful? And all of that, of course, somewhat disappears in Greek and is way beyond us by the time we get through to English. One other piece just to note about the actual text itself of this, verse 13, super familiar. Where does Jesus originally say this? Pop quiz without notice, sorry. It's in another gospel, but it's in a really different setting. Sermon on the Mount. Yes, excellent. Two people got there at the same time, I think. Matthew 6, verse 24. which is, and it's actually word for word in terms of what Luke has here. So sort of the suggestion is, and I think it's good sense in it, is that Luke actually has moved this saying, out of its context and put it here with a selection of Jesus' comments on wealth. Remember, in Luke chapter 1, this is a very self-consciously deliberate account. Yes, this word servant, interestingly, in verse 3, it's a different word to the word we've had for steward. So there's not really that same sort of connection that you might have expected back to the parable. Anyway, so I think Luke's making the concluding point, just rearranging some of Jesus' teaching from another occasion on the same subject of wealth. And again, my wife is still looking at me, I don't even have to look up to know, thinking, so what? Well, I'm glad you asked. So what? Well, if verse 8b through to 9 contain the immediate conclusion to the parable, verse 10 to 13 is Jesus, and then maybe Luke's, follow-up conclusion or points. So, the parable of the unjust steward has a clever rogue who's commended for at least taking action. And there's something in that for us to learn, that Jesus makes that point. But then verse 10 through to 13 sort of act as a little bit of a corrective, a balancing item, just to make sure we don't misunderstand the parable, is what I think Jesus and then Luke are doing here. The point of the parable is to take action in the face of impending crisis, but it is absolutely not to be dishonest like the steward was. And that's the point that's really been drilled home. So verse 10, who's faithful in very little, faithful in much. The one who's dishonest in little is dishonest in much. So it sort of makes it clear when we follow the instruction of verse 9 to use mammon wisely for our future benefit, obviously that shouldn't be dishonestly. Money appears to be a big deal, but it's not. It's just a tiny little thing compared to salvation. But the reality is, I think, probably safe to say that, reality is money is what, top 5, top 3 things that distort our values or our ability to apply our values, like greed, selfishness. I'm going to say it's top 3. And so I think the challenge then in verse 10 about being faithful in little, faithful in much, probably invites us just to pause and think, okay, well, how do we apply our values when it comes to cash, when it comes to filthy lucre? Are we, finders keepers type of people? Are we people who look for loopholes and ways to build our wealth at others' expense? Are we a little selfish with our cash? Are we faithful in those little things as God sees them? It's a pretty horrible parable to be talking about personally when the rubber hits the road. But Jesus was pushing his audience and pushing us as well to think about, well, how do we actually use wealth? And verse 11, there's a perspective change, verse 11 and 12, there's a perspective change thing here. Jesus wants us to see that it's not just about being consistent. As he says, if you haven't been trustworthy with someone else's property, and he's talking about cash, who will give you your own riches? Who will give you the kingdom opportunity? If you haven't been trustworthy with someone else's property, he doesn't say if you've been trustworthy with your own financial resources, because Jesus doesn't see it that way. We are stewards of God's estate. Whatever wealth, whatever riches we have is actually God's. And that fundamentally contradicts our Western perspective. Our perspective is we work to get ahead. We faithfully save. We put aside this money. We've earned it. We control our destiny, our hard work. We make our own future. We have very much we have control. The locus of control is, ourselves as opposed to external. That's not Jesus' perspective, right? Whatever we have has been given to us by God, and we are stewarding that. So how we use it is how we actually use God's wealth. So are we using those assets in line with his values, or are we, to use the language of the parable, squandering it, using it on ourselves? As I said, it's an uncomfortable parable and set of teachings to be talking about. Should have stopped at the end of verse 8. And verse 13 is the final kicker. It's a further general warning, as we said, probably put there by Luke out of the context of the Sermon on the Mount, a general warning on the danger of wealth. And Scripture speaks consistently about it, Timothy and the like. We know the words well, perhaps a little bit too well, because perhaps they lack some of the punch and some of the challenge that they did when Jesus delivered them. You know, the Pharisees certainly got upset when they heard Jesus making this parable and these teachings, because Jesus' teaching on wealth is confronting. Like the Pharisees got very upset. They started ridiculing Jesus, and they were relatively religious. They were considered by Jesus' disciples to be religious, but actually they loved money. Doesn't matter how good you look. The challenge of the section is high, and it ends in a very simple black and white piece. We cannot serve God and mammon. Now, we're very good at creating exceptions for ourselves. We are very good at creating complexity and grey that enables us to sort of navigate our way through life in a way which is not perhaps too difficult. But Jesus says, no, not with money. It's one or the other. We have a mindset that it is all God's and we act accordingly with his generosity and care, or we have a mindset that it's ours. We are either serving God with it and seeing it that way, or the other. The wealth that has been entrusted to us by God, are we going to be trustworthy? Because the point comes when we will be challenged. It's not necessarily in a crisis. Oftenly, it's just in that boring, incremental everyday, the drip, drip, drip of living. But we make choices, and those choices betray that dichotomy. We vote for wealth, or we vote for God. And again, you might as well change that to me. We make excuses. I can point to complexity. I can point to all sorts of things. But Jesus just says no. It's way more simpler and way more confronting than we necessarily would like it to be. Who are we really devoted to? Because categorically, he says, we can't have it both ways. Now, I appreciate that might be a bit of a mood killer. But the parables weren't meant to be nice bedtime stories for children. They were meant to be a tad uncomfortable. They were meant to make us think, oh, I didn't like that message. How's that play for me? What does that mean for me? And there's challenging, uncomfortable pieces, not just, one, that come out of this parable. Are we fair dinkum in recognising that everything is about to change with our lives because the kingdom is coming? And how are we responding to that? Are we treating the return of Jesus as an impending, life-changing reality and responding with everything? Or is it a bit vague? Do we have the clarity of the steward or not? Are we faithful in the small stuff, money, all of the time? Do I perceive my resources as God-given, as part of his estate that I have to steward? Or is my bank balance my doing, my asset, my thing? Are we trying to quietly rationalise the black and white dichotomy of serve mammon, serve God? Because Jesus is pretty emphatic about there only being two options, and we can't do both. Yeah, some challenging teachings. The unjust steward, very unusual character to star in a parable. But Jesus uses him to demonstrate, I think, some pretty interesting lessons, how to respond to a life-changing situation, how to seize the day, to be very clear about what's in front of us. And yes, God is gracious. Yes, God is love. But we need to be awake to the reality of the challenge of, yes, our amazing situation, but then how do we act with faith and with prudence as we wait for Jesus' coming? Thank you.